Okay, well, welcome everyone, and we will take questions at the end, so please write your questions down and I'll be happy to answer them. This is the final financial performance report that we get from the government in time for anybody to do anything, so we have prepared Q2 financial report cards for everyone who has assigned beneficiaries who had at least 10. Because if you had fewer than 10, it's just the numbers are so, they're not really reflective of anything because that's just too low of a number. But for everyone with over 10, we've got a report card. And we will be sending those out to your secure email boxes later this afternoon. And once you take a look at them, please don't hesitate to give me a call if you do have questions. It's not moving. What am I doing? Okay. Well, the first and most important thing is this is the last year of the ACO, so this is the last chance to get shared savings. And based on where we are after the first 2 quarters, it's certainly possible for the ACO to earn shared savings, and obviously that would be in everybody's interest. And so I'm going to start with just the 3 main takeaways. The first is the simplest thing to do to increase the odds of shared savings is to make sure that everyone who you haven't seen yet this year comes in for an appointment. Obviously, if they haven't been seen yet, they probably aren't costing a lot. But if you don't see them at all, you don't get the benefit of that person's low utilization. It won't be factored into the total. You have to see them in order for them to count towards the score. So please go through your patient list. Make sure that everyone who you believe is your patient, who you have not seen yet this year, comes in for a visit before the end of the year. Ideally, you should have them come in for an annual wellness visit so that you can maximize the likelihood that you complete the quality measures associated with their care. The second thing that is very helpful is doing advanced care planning. Many people do not want lots of treatment, especially if it is invasive and has a risk of serious adverse effects. And, just because you can do something doesn't mean that it should be done. And indeed, there are many patients who, if they understand the situation, will decide that they do not want to have invasive elective surgeries or some other things, especially if they are already frail. Because the studies at this point are pretty clear that elective surgery on elderly, frail patients rarely goes well, and really should be. It's unlikely that the benefits of that are going to outweigh the risks of it. And the final thing is to just avoid unnecessary costs. And we're going to look at the ACO's numbers, but we remain wildly more expensive than most other ACOs in the country. And it appears that is because we are still doing a lot of things that others have found to be unnecessary for optimal care. So you all know we've had 3 main targets this year: reducing hospital costs, reducing home health charges, and reducing other high-cost services. To get shared savings, the ACO has to save about $4 million. As you can see, we have almost that amount in every single category here that we would save and then some if we were simply performing at the ACO average rate. So for acute care hospitals, we are spending about 147% of what other ACOs spend. For skilled nursing, we're spending about 143%. For Part B physician supplier, we are at almost double, and similarly, we're at almost double for home health. But obviously, the Part B physician supplier category has a lot more money in it, and you can see that if we were to bring that down just to average, that would be $21 million in savings, which is obviously wildly more than would be necessary.
Hey, Catherine, is this across the country or just in California?
The ACO averages are across the country, but the California numbers are not very different.
Okay,
so
thanks.
It's just that the Conejo has just been a very high utilizing area, and you know, obviously that's going to start impacting everybody as everything moves to value-based payment. This shows you where the ACO has been starting in the first year and then the second year, and those two numbers are actually final, and then the third year, all we have is the results as of the end of the second quarter. But you can see that home health agency utilization has been going down as a general matter. Part B physician supplier is down over 2018, although still up quite a bit from 2017, where it starts obviously very high. Skilled nursing, we're down some in 2019 so far, which is good. And in hospital, we're down from the first year, but still up from last year. So these are challenging figures. And this shows you how this looks if we look at it graphed. So you can see the amounts of money that are implicated by each of these different factors. So for home health, we're down about $95,000 for Part B physician supplier. We're down about a little over $1 million for skilled nursing. We're down about $650,000, but for the short-term hospital, we're actually up almost $500,000 over last year. And so you can see we're moving. I mean, we're definitely saving the government money, but for you all to earn shared savings, we have to save about $4 million. So really about $2.5 million or so, $3 million more than we've saved so far to date. So again, the priorities: eliminate the cases that could be treated as observation but are being coded as inpatient hospitalizations, and understand and eliminate to the extent you can the places that are high, including the home health, skilled nursing, and the Part B services. So the report card will give you a sense of where you are as of the end of the second quarter. And again, this is the government's numbers, so we have nothing to do with it other than to compile them. It will tell you how often your patients received annual wellness visits and advanced care planning. We do that based on what's billed, so if you've done those services but didn't bill them, then we won't have them. We're going to show you how often you had inpatient admissions that were less than 2 midnights. So cases where perhaps they should have been coded as observation, but the hospital coded them as inpatient admission. We're going to show you how your home health stays look compared to average, and then how often your patients receive services from the 2 home health agencies that the board has made preferred, which is Los Robles Home Care Services and Assisted Home Care. And those were really the 2 that were billing less than a full episode when it wasn't called for, which is why they were preferred over others who appeared to always bill at least a full episode, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the first page of the report card that I've just covered. You will see that it will show you what the ACO as a whole is doing, and then where you are. So if we look at the first set of bar graphs there, you can see that for annual wellness visits, the ACO as a whole after the first 2 quarters was at about 26, I can't quite read that far, 26% or so, 27% were of the population had received an annual wellness visit. This particular mythical provider had 17, so they were not doing as well as the ACO. And of course, the goal is to get to 100% of your patients having annual wellness visits. Similarly, the ACO as a whole is not doing very well in advanced care planning, at least billing for that. In this case, this mythical provider was doing much better than the ACO. The next set of pie charts deal with the short stay visits. What percentage of the visits that are less than 2 midnights are being billed as observation as opposed to inpatient. And in this case, generally speaking, stay in a hospital that's less than 2 midnights would typically be coded as observation. And you can see the mythical provider here has not done well on that at all. Almost all of their short stay visits have been billed as inpatient. On the second column, the second row there, you can see home health usage. So if it's green there, you can see that's the number of patients that were, or the percentage of patients that were received less than a full episode of home health care. That means they had 4 or fewer home health visits. If you see the orangish color, that is the 1 visit, 1 episode. So that means that that patient had 1 episode, which is any number of visits from 5 above over a course of 60 days. And the red is for those that have had 2 or more episodes. So basically, to have 2 episodes, that means that a person must have been getting home health services for more than 60 calendar days, and obviously some people had more than that. And you can see the first chart shows how the ACO has done, and then the second pie chart shows how you have done. And then finally, we're showing the percentages of visits that were held with one of the preferred home health agencies, and you can see that the ACO is not using, in general, people in the ACO are not using those 2 home health agencies, which may explain why you see so little of the green under 1 episode visits. Moving on. This shows you the range of what we saw across the ACO. So for Annual wellness visits, the average for the ACO was 16.8% of patients got an annual wellness visit. The range was 0 up to 36.7%. And we understand that's the first 2 quarters, so we hope the year-end numbers will be higher. Obviously, this is wildly better than it was last year, but still room for improvement. Advanced care planning, the ACO average was a little under 4%. The range was 0 up to 20% of the time. For the one-day visits that were coded as observation, the ACO average was about 61%. And again, the range was everywhere from 0, so people who were always having those short stays coded as inpatient, to 100% of the time where they were always being coded as observation. And as far as the home health distribution went, under 1 episode ranged from 2% of patients up to 17% of patients. The 1 episode for the ACO as a whole was at 55% of visits were 1 full episode. The range was anywhere from 0 to 100% of the visits in any one practice. 2+ episodes, the average for the ACO was 42% of patients, home health patients had more than 60 days of home health services. And again, the range was 0. Some practices never ordered home health, to some practices where every single patient who received home health was receiving more than 60 days worth of services. And finally, as far as the preferred home health agency, the ACO average was about 20% using the preferred agencies, and the range again was 0 up to 100%. Some of you were always using the preferred agency.
Catherine?
Okay, yeah.
One quick question on the advanced care planning.
Mm-hmm.
Our provider he notates whether the patient has advanced care planning, but if they already have it, he just notates it and moves forward. How does that get captured in the snapshots?
The only thing that the snapshot picks up are bill charges for the advanced care planning code.
Right. So if they already have it and he's notating it, there's nothing for us to do. We can't redo an advanced care planning.
Well, believe it or not, you can actually bill advanced care planning at every visit if it's medically appropriate for a patient who is, facing a lot of challenges and potentially has some changes going on. But in any event, the numbers here are by patient. So the percentages are the percentage of your total patient population that has any one visit. So I guess what you're suggesting is that they might have had advanced care planning the prior year, and so the doctor...
Well, they already have a plan in place, so he's not going to reiterate and go over it. They've already done it. They already have like a living trust or whatever. They've already made their arrangements. Yes,
so absolutely, if it's a patient that doesn't, that there has been no changes, that they have a clear plan and everybody's comfortable, then that you are absolutely right, there should not be another bill for that. So that's...
Right, so that's what he's seeing. He's asking, do you have it? And they're either saying yes or they're saying, no, I'm not interested, and that's kind of what we're dealing with on our end.
Right, we understand. But as I say, if it is perfectly possible for somebody to be billed more than once for advanced care planning, if they're, to the extent that it's appropriate for a patient. So if things are changing, if there's a family member who's started to express concerns, or even if the patient just wants to go over it, right? That's all perfectly appropriate. Okay, so now in the page 2 of the report card goes over the performance on 5 categories of things. The first is ER visits, the second is Part B procedures, the third is SNF admissions, the fourth is Part B drugs, and the fifth is MRI. And basically the report card is the same in that the ACO results are there. That's the average for the ACO, and then the results of the person for whom the report card was done is in the bar to the right of that. You can see the bars show that the average cost per patient, and then the information below the bars tells you how many patients were involved and the total cost of those, as well as the ACO's total cost for that category. And again, you can see here that the costs, for example, Part B procedures, you can see how high that is. And that's, as I say, that's pretty close to 2 times what the average would be in other ACOs. So folks are just ordering a lot of procedures, and a lot of knows what types, but it's just a lot of stuff. And it just depends on obviously you have to do what's medically appropriate, but as I say, at this point the numbers are far enough different from average that it does appear that a lot of things are being done that perhaps don't need to be done.
Is the average listed on that chart with the bar, or is that just the ACO and the provider?
That's the ACO average, but the ACO averages in these categories are anywhere from 150 to 200% of the ACO of the total ACO average. So all of the ACO numbers are already high.
Oh, okay. That's why I was wondering if we could have another bar that shows what the country or the California ACO average is, so we would know.
Yes, we can certainly. We're not going to put it on this report card, but I will get that information out to you so you can see. Okay. But on average, it's going to be about half.
Okay, so thank you.
If you were to look at these, they would be about half of what the blue bar is here. The average ACO across the country or in California would be about half that level.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and again, you can see that the range within the ACO is very broad. Okay, so for ER visits, we have a total of for the first 2 quarters, 747 of the patients got an ER visit. Okay, and the average that was spent at that ER visit was $2,278, okay? But the range of what was paid in ER visits by practice was anywhere from nothing, they had no ER visits, up to $13,000 a patient. So you can see how broad the range is in what's happening. The same with Part B procedures. We had 4,400 patients who got at least one Part B procedure. The average that was spent on that for each patient was about $1,100, but the range in the ACO was, for some practices, as low as $370 a patient to a high of almost $3,200 a patient. SNF admissions, again, you can see a very broad range. Many practices had no SNF admissions, and there were practices that were spending as much as almost $29,000 per patient that was admitted to SNFs. Part B drugs, again, you see the wide range there. Obviously, a huge part of that is chemotherapy drugs. Not surprisingly, oncologists the drugs that oncologists use are very, very expensive and make those patients more expensive, and there may not be a lot of options there, but there are some Part B drugs where the government and other people have basically said that there are alternatives that are a lot cheaper than whatever the most expensive brand might be. And then finally, MRIs. Again, you can see we had 805 MRIs that were 805 patients in the ACO who got an MRI in the first 2 quarters. The average spent on that was $441 a patient. And again, the range was anywhere from 0, so there were practices that never ordered an MRI, up to practices that were spending over $1,200 a patient on MRI. So the goal, of course, is to beat the ACO average. Ideally, 100% of patients would receive annual wellness visits. And I think Abba's raised a good point on advanced care planning. Obviously, you're not going to bill for advanced care planning if it's not medically appropriate for a patient. But clearly, at this level with the ACO, there's lots of patients that are not, that have not had advanced care planning. You want basically no patients to be charged with an inpatient admission if really they've just been in observation. For home health, you don't want people to get a full episode of home health if they really don't need it. If they need 4 visits, the difference between 4 visits and 5 visits is a lot of money. And unfortunately, it still appears that routinely patients in the ACO are being billed for the 5 visits. And again, obviously, 60 days of home health is a lot of home health. If somebody needs more than 60 days, then certainly they should get it. But again, our episodes of home health are wildly in excess of what the averages are. And again, we know that the 2 vendors that the ACO board has preferred will bill less than 1 episode, and so we know that they are trying anyway to bill for the medically necessary services and not more than medically necessary services. And then for each of those 5 categories, the goal would be to have to be under the ACO average, which, as we've described before, is already very high. You know, what are the factors that affect this? Well, you know, particularly for some people, they don't have that many patients assigned to them, and we all know that in the world of statistics, small numbers make it difficult to get reasonable extrapolations. We didn't even make report cards for people that had fewer than 10 patients, but still people that have under 30. Typically, people think that 30 is a good sample, but some of you don't have that many. Patient risk factor is clearly an issue. If you've got much sicker patients, then your numbers are going to be higher. But again, the patient risk factor of our ACO is actually not higher than the average across the country, so that does not explain the variation in service utilization. And then, of course, there are certain patient conditions that are going to obviously cost more, with the most obvious example being cancer and increased costs for Part B drugs. And then, of course, ACOs are an open network. That means the patient has the ability to go wherever they want to go. And if they want to go to Cedars-Sinai or some place that may be very expensive, there's not anything that you can do about that, and you still get charged with those costs. As far as choosing wisely and optimizing resource use, obviously the first priority is always to put the patient first. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that can be done more efficiently and still provide excellent care for patients. So Most patients have no interest in being hospitalized. If you can avoid that, that's wonderful. That may mean having patients, providing other alternatives for them other than going to the emergency department. So you can let them know about urgent care facilities that may be available, or if you offer after-hours care. And as we've discussed before, once they get to the hospital, if it's not clear that they need to be admitted, it may make more sense to admit them for observation before you make the admission determination. As far as unnecessary home health, you need to make sure that that initial certification is warranted. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but basically the patient has to be homebound. You can't order home health just because the patient would be more comfortable if they didn't have to go and get their physical therapy at the physical therapy clinic. If they have the ability to travel, then they are not qualified for home health. And secondly, you need to be clear about how many days of home health they need, because if you don't specify that, then that leaves it up to the home health agency to make its own decision. And because they get paid 2 or 3 times more if they have 5 visits instead of 4, obviously they may err on the side of going with the 5 days. And then finally, obviously, you want to monitor patients closely, because if you order 2 or 3 or 4 days of home health, and then it turns out the patient needs more, then you may need to add more services. On the other hand, if they have gotten one full episode, which is all the services they need over the course of 60 days, then they may not need a second course of home health, and you certainly want to make sure that you have evaluated the patient before that second certification is given. And similarly for SNF, you want to make sure that people are not put in SNF unless they really need to be in SNF. And then you need to be on top of what the care plan is going to be for the patient. You want to, again, monitor them closely and discharge them when they don't need SNF services anymore. Quickly, for the hospital reimbursement, generally speaking, hospitals get paid a flat amount based on how they code the patient's DRG. And if the patient has complications or comorbidities, then they get paid more than if they don't. And then if there's really high costs, there's some extra money that the government kicks in. But really, it's up to the physician or other person that's responsible for the patient's care at the hospital to make the determination as to whether a patient should be admitted as an inpatient or put in observation. And the general expectation is that patients don't get admitted for inpatient care unless they are expected to be there at least 2 midnights. And, you know, so those are things that you should certainly be considering when these determinations are being made. Observation is basically to make a determination about whether the patient is sick enough that they really do need to be admitted, or if they can be sent home or potentially to SNF, although there is an issue with that. And again, generally, you make the decision whether you're going to either discharge the patient or admit them once they've been put in observation after the first day, but certainly before the second day. And as you can see here, the difference in what the hospital gets paid is quite a bit different depending on whether it is an observation or it's billed as a DRG. The one caveat is that if the patient ultimately does need to go to a SNF, the government will not pay for that unless the patient has a minimum 3-day inpatient stay. So that is a reason why often patients will be kept in a hospital for 3 days because they know that without that the patient's not going to get SNF coverage. Home health, very similar. It's up to the doctor to basically sign the care plan and certify that the services are medically necessary. The patient is not qualified for home health unless they are homebound. And they need to have either skilled nursing care or skilled physical therapy, speech therapy, or continuing occupational therapy to warrant home health. If they need somebody to help them cook meals and, clean and stuff, that may not qualify for home health. They may need to get an aide or somebody in to help them, but that is not a Medicare benefit unless it qualifies for these requirements. One of the things we've talked about is whether it makes more sense in some circumstances for the practice to do a home visit right after discharge before certifying for home health. The advantage of that is that the government now will pay for the home visit, any home visit. You don't have to have any special reason why you're doing the visit at home, and that visit can be done by a physician assistant or a nurse practitioner. It doesn't have to be by the physician. That way you actually really get to see what's happening with the patient, right? You can do all the things that you would want to do for transitional care, make sure that the medication, that the patient has picked up the medication that they should have picked up after discharge, that they have got those medications at home in a place where they can easily get them and take them, that they don't have other medications that they're still taking that perhaps are now contraindicated. You can determine whether the patient really is able to take care of themselves, that they've got a plan for eating, and that the house is safe, that there's heat or air conditioning depending on the time of year, that if there are rugs or other things that the patient may trip on, you can help roll those up and get them out of the way. If they need a walker or whatever, you can help them get that stuff, and you can make sure that they understand what they need to do in order to optimize their recovery. And at that point, you may determine at that visit that the patient clearly does need home health, and then you can make an appropriate order as to what those services should be. So the advantage of that is, as we say, is it really gives you a much better handle on what the patient's true status is post-discharge, and then make a fully informed determination about any home health orders. Home health has a whole bunch of ways that they decide how much is going to get paid for a home health episode. The episode, as I've mentioned, is 60 days. So whether the patient is seen 5 times or 60 times in that 60-day period, the home health agency gets a flat rate for that. And the rate will range, as you can see, from 0.5 of the average to 2 times the average. So it's a pretty big range based on basically how sick the patient is. But if the patient doesn't need 5 visits, then the episodes are going to be paid basically fee for service. And so that's why if the patient doesn't need 5 visits, if they come back from, hello? Okay, hopefully that will work. Anyway, if they come back, if they get back home and they need a couple of visits for a couple of weeks, that's 4 visits, and that would not justify a full episode cost. If they need more than 4 visits, it's the same price whether they get 5 visits or the 60 visits. So clearly there's no, if the patient needs visits after the 4, then you should order as many as they need in that episode. And again, these are some examples from last year. I didn't update this for this year, but they'll be, you know, a little higher probably for each one of those. But you can see the difference between the episode payment and what they would get paid for providing these specific services. Okay, this is the government's SNF report, and we just put this in just so you could see. This shows you on the right-hand column, that's what the average is for all ACOs in the country. The column on the left is our ACO, and you can see where we are higher than average. So our average utilization days are 1,400 as opposed to 1,263. Our length of stay, average length of stay is 26 days instead of 24. The payment per stay is quite a bit higher. Our average payment per stay is $15,699 as opposed to $11,202 for the average ACO, and obviously the payment per day is higher for our ACO. And unfortunately, even though we're spending all of that money, we also have more readmissions than the average ACO. So the average ACO has about 28.5% 28.5 out of 1,000 patients get readmitted. We have almost 33 that get readmitted to a hospital within 30 days, and with the SNFs, we're also having readmissions to SNFs at a higher rate. So again, these are our sobering statistics that we don't know. We haven't dived into each one of these to look at what all might have gone into this. But as I say, I think we can't explain it by looking at the average complexity of the patients that we have compared to the MSSP ACO average. Okay, and finally, this is just, the joke that, there's all kinds of new wonderful things out there, but if it really isn't going to help the individual patient, then it may not be a good thing, and that's the hard choice that you all are always having to make. So with that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, and otherwise, don't hesitate once you've got the report card. If that raises questions for you, feel free to give me a call. We do have all of the data for everybody, and if you want to look at the individual cases, your individual patients that were involved in creating these reports, we can show that to you. It's for many of the physicians who've looked at it, it's quite it's quite interesting because you actually can see 100% of the care that the patient got, including what the hospitals charged, what the home health agencies charged, what the skilled nursing facilities charged, what other physicians charged, and even just knowing what other places the patient got care. Some physicians are quite surprised to find out that their patients have been going some places that they had no idea. But in any event, we're more than happy to share that with you if that is helpful to you. So with that, are there any more questions?
Are there any plans for the upcoming ACO? Is that still unclear, or is that done?
Well,
or?
At this point, it looks like we're not going to meet the threshold of the patient threshold requirement. So I think the discussion is that we may just go and do a virtual group again this coming year, because we have a number of people that were very interested in joining the ACO, but they couldn't because they were finishing up their final term with a different ACO. So we think there's plenty of people to do an ACO in 2021. And if we do just the virtual group, then that basically lets everybody continue to track what they're doing. It lets you continue to use the web interface measures as your quality measure set for MIPS, and it doesn't give you the other MIPS benefits. Unfortunately, it doesn't take you out of the requirement to consider cost, to be rated on cost, and there's a little more obligation with respect to the improvement activity that's not required for people in ACOs. But that's certainly an option, and I'm pretty sure. Mary, did you want to say something about that now, or you're going to be putting something out on that in the next week or two?
We'll definitely be sending out a formal notice, letting everybody know of the transition and what needs to be done to take advantage of the virtual group opportunity. But then the Medical Association Board did approve last night to go forward with the virtual group offering. So, and the Foundation Board will be meeting tonight to decide what the strategy will be for 2021 ACO offering.